Oh, here, uh, Terry is just joining us. This is our Wednesday night Bible study. This is the third session in a series that traces the storyline of the Bible from Genesis to the book of Revelation. In our previous sessions are available on the church website and on our YouTube channel. If you would like to catch up by tuning in to those two previous sessions, feel free to do that. I'm going to just give a previously in the land of the Bible before we go into tonight's presentation. Before I do that, I want to check among the participants who are on tonight on Zoom if there's any question, something left up in the air for you from either of the two previous sessions that you would like to either address now or at least make sure that it's addressed as we continue the presentation. Any questions?
No.
Okay. If you have your Bible in front of you, you can look at the table of contents. It's not absolutely necessary, but it may help you. Here's the very quick overview. The story begins with Abraham and Sarah. It begins with them in what now is Iraq, what's called Mesopotamia, between the two rivers, that's the Tigris and the Euphrates. And they were just everyday people there, and God, for no apparent reason, chose them and made a threefold promise to them that they would be the ancestors of a great people, that people would own a land that God would show them, and that through them all the people of the world would be blessed. Based on that promise, Abraham and Sarah left their homes, left their families, left their kin, and traveled to what is now the land of Israel or Palestine, and they lived the rest of their lives there, but they never owned the land. They were always tenants. They had a good relationship with the well, basically we would call the Arab or the Canaanite owners of the land. They shared the land. They had very few conflicts. And Abraham and Sarah eventually had a son and began kind of I won't call it a dynasty, but began building a nation. Abraham and Sarah grow old and die in that land, never having owned anything except, as you'll remember, and it's an important little touch, that Abraham had bought a grave site, a cave to bury Sarah in, and that becomes the tomb of the patriarchs, which is still known to this day, and it's a contentious point on the West Bank in Palestine. But in any case, that story continues with the building of the kin, and then the tribes, and then the people of Israel. Because of a famine in their land, in the third generation, this is Abraham's great-grandchildren, they migrate to Egypt. And wonderful story that you know of, the story, the cycle of stories of Joseph and the coat of many colors. We won't recite the wonderful details again, but suffice it to say, these children of Israel, these Hebrews, that's another name for them, Israelites, another name. We're talking about all of the same, different names for the same group of people. They end up originally as honored guests in Egypt, but eventually as a dynasty's change in Egypt on the throne, the Pharaoh, the new Pharaoh feels threatened by all these Israelites in his kingdom, and essentially enslaves them. God calls, and again, wonderful details that we're not going to go into in this quick overview, but we went into them in last week's session. God calls one of the Israelites, a kid named Moses with a great backstory, but calls Moses to lead the people of Israel out of their slavery. Moses is sent by God to the Pharaoh, demanding that the Pharaoh let the Israelites go. The Pharaoh refuses over and over and over again. God punishes Egypt over and over and over again. Ultimately, the great punishment is what we now and what our Jewish cousins continue to commemorate as the Passover, and that is the commandment by God that the Israelites gather together on a particular night and have this ceremonial, this ritual meal, and be prepared to run at a moment's notice, or to get up and leave at a moment's notice. And God tells the Israelites to, as part of this meal, they're supposed to have a roasted lamb. The blood of that lamb has been painted on they have painted on the doorways,
right,
on their doorways. And God says, or the story in Exodus says, that God, that night, while the Israelites were having their meal together, the angel of death went all over Egypt and killed the firstborn in every family, including the Pharaoh's family. And the uproar across the kingdom was so strong that the Pharaoh finally said, "Yes, get the heck out of here." And Moses organized everybody, and according to the narration, it's thousands and thousands of Israelites by this time. I don't remember the number. I'll check. I'll check a reference to what Exodus claims is the number that it go out from Egypt, but it's something like 350,000 or something. A huge number of people head out of Egypt. They're just following Moses. Moses says, "Follow me." They do, and they get to what is described in the Bible as the Red Sea. You know the story at the Red Sea. They get to the Red Sea. They can't cross the Red Sea. The Pharaoh changes his mind and sends his army to go recapture the slaves. They're about to get the slaves, the Israelites, with their backs up against the Red Sea, and Moses, at God's command, performs a miracle, and the sea parts. The Israelites go across on dry land, and then the Egyptian army follows them onto this supposedly dry land. When the Israelites get to the other side, the water comes crashing down, and the whole Israelite army is wiped out. That's a huge remembrance point for the Israelites, and for our Jewish neighbors now, the crossing of the Red Sea. It's also a reference that later Christian writers use a lot, including for baptismal imagery. That the crossing of the Red Sea is kind of a prefigurement of our baptism, which carries us from death, represented by Egypt, to new life, represented by what's ever on the other side of the Red Sea. I want to stop there for a second and see if you have questions. Yeah, Iris.
What was on the other side of the Red Sea? Where did they land? Where did they end up?
An incredible desert. It was really, really bad. They desperately needed a GPS. It actually took them, and this is an important part of this story. The other side of the Red Sea is the Sinai Peninsula.
Okay.
It's the Sinai Desert. It is an absolute wasteland. It has some jagged mountains, and one of the mountains is Mount Sinai.
Okay.
Mount Sinai is the mountain that Moses originally saw that burning bush and went up to investigate, and God said, Moses, don't be afraid. I've chosen you to lead my people to freedom. This is the same mountain that's in that desert.
Okay, but Moses never made it across.
He made it across. He made it across here, across the Red Sea. Yes. We'll talk about why he didn't make it across the Jordan River.
Oh, okay.
That's the key that we're that we're moving toward, is
Okay.
the Jordan River. Other questions at this point? Okay, so the Israelites cross. They cross over. The Egyptians have been wiped out. Again, as I referenced last week, there's no reference in Egyptian history, in any kind of archives or wall paintings or anything like that talks about or suggests this kind of national tragedy. But that might be something that they just suppressed as their Egyptian history continued. We just don't know. We can't prove the yes or the no of this from Egyptian archaeology. Other questions yet? Okay. They get to the other side. They realize that God has saved them. And Moses says, God has told me that God is leading us to the land that he promised to Abraham and Sarah and their descendants, namely the land of Canaan, the land of the Canaanites. Sometimes easier to say that because Canaan doesn't work in my mouth, at least. the land of the Canaanites.
Okay.
The Canaanites lived on the other side of this Sinai Peninsula. If you get a chance to look at a map of Egypt, you'll still see the Sinai Peninsula, and it's just this big desert wedge on the eastern side of Egypt proper, and it's what separates Egypt from Israel. At one time during the 1973 war, Israel occupied the Sinai Peninsula, and kind of used as a buffer to keep Egypt from encroaching on them. Anyway, that's this very same Sinai Peninsula. What the story tells us is that the Israelites, instead of crossing the Sinai Peninsula in a matter of a few weeks, they actually took 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. But interestingly, all of it is they're being guided by God. God has right there at the river, after they cross the Red Sea, God sets up basically a beacon that says, okay, now follow me to the promised land. And during the day, it's a column, a cloud that's goes up and down like a column. And at night it's fiery, and everybody can see it and follow it. They follow God for 40 years in this small but nasty desert. And the most important thing that happens during that time, there's lots of stories filling in those 40 years, but by far the most important thing that happens during that time is when they get to Mount Sinai. God calls Moses up to the top of the mountain, and God gives Moses the Torah, or the teachings. It's often kind of conflated down to the Ten Commandments, but it really is all of the teaching of kind of fleshing out, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And God gave this. It's unfortunately often called the law, but again, we should call it the Torah, or the teachings. And it really is a blueprint for living in a way that reflects God's shalom, where everybody has enough, nobody has too much, where when somebody is in need, somebody responds, where everybody has access to the things they need. It's the kind of the equilibrium that comes from abundance. You don't have to fight over who's going to control what resources and limit them to others. This is kind of the vision of God's shalom, the whole creation in balance. And the teaching is, the Torah is again, kind of not exactly a rule book, although it's been used that way, but more of I would almost call it a philosophy of how to interact with God and with neighbors, including enemies, in a way that respects God's shalom, respects the image of God that is in each person. That teaching, the Torah, is understood by many, many people and many Jews, not all Jews, but by many Jews, to be that the fulfillment of that blessing that through the descendants of Abraham and Sarah, all the world would be blessed. All the world would receive a blessing. And I, for one, very much respect the Torah, the teaching, as a wonderful reflection of what I was talking about, this sense of the whole world at peace, in shalom, experiencing shalom, balance. We Christians don't see the law or the Torah in exactly that same kind of terms, and we tend to say the blessing for all people that was promised to Abraham and Sarah is Jesus, their very distant descendant, but nonetheless a son of Israel. That he is the fulfillment of God's promise to bless all people. Let me stop there for a second and see if you've got questions or pushback or anything. Okay. So Moses is up on the mountain. He gets all these teachings. He comes down from the mountain and he teaches the children of Israel, and kind of the gist of the story is that during all of this wandering in the wilderness, they were put to the test over and over and over again to see if they would in fact conform to the Torah, use the Torah as their kind of their measuring rod for their behavior. And over and over and over, they fail. They complain about God. They rebel against Moses. They try to build a new God of their own that will serve their needs. And it's a wonderful story after story of these trials and tribulations of the people of Israel as they're moving around the Sinai and then ultimately toward the Promised Land. So they're ready to move into the Promised Land. We don't know exactly what the kind of God's criteria for saying, okay, get ready to go. They decide the best way into the Promised Land is just to go right up the what is now the west coast of Israel. Just enter from the west and take possession of the land. It happens that the people who owned the land at the bottom, where they normally the easiest place to go in would be, had a powerful army. So they went all the way around to the other side of the Jordan River, and they approached the Promised Land from the east rather than from the west. So basically, you would say from Syria, from today's Syria, instead of from today's Egypt, They came in from today's Syria. Before they moved into the land, as they were ready to move into the land, God tells Moses that Moses is not going into the promised land, and there's again a little bit of a backstory there that you can find on your own if you're interested. But God takes Moses up on a very, very tall mountain overlooking the Jordan River, and he sees the promised land on the other side of the Jordan River. God gives him that consolation to be able to see the promised land, even though he's not allowed to go there. There's a very, very touching scene in that there on the mountain, Moses dies and God himself buries him. It's a really poignant scene. Before Moses dies, he says, as you go into the land, first of all, Joshua, my assistant, is going to be your new leader. And the Torah that I have shared with you all and taught to you through all these years, that's to be your guide. So Moses dies. Joshua leads the Israelites into the promised land. There's a whole series of stories of battles, clashes, massacres, double dealing, all kinds of treachery involved in eventually the Israelites have control of basically the land that we now know of as Israel and Palestine. And they have defeated all of the people who owned that land. And that is now the fulfillment of that second part of the promise. They are already a great nation, and now they have a land of their own. And again, depending on how you understand the Torah, they have in their midst the teaching from God Himself. They for the next couple of hundred years, they kind of settle in the land, organize themselves into tribes, if they weren't already. We're not clear about that previously, but they have 12 different lands or tribes, and the for 100 or so years, they're just a confederation of these tribes. When some outsider invades one of the tribes, some of the other tribes might band together to repel the outsider. But by and large, they were 12 semi-independent tribes. Meanwhile, there was still a religious cult that had been developed during these 40 years in the wilderness. God had described how God wanted his presence to be symbolized, and it was to be in a tent like everybody else were in tents. It was to be in a tent, and the centerpiece in the tent was the Ark of the Covenant, which which held the tablets that had the Torah inscribed on them by God himself. It also had the rod that Moses used to part the Red Sea and to perform some of his other wonderful miracles. And it had a bowl of manna. Remember manna, and again, part of the story, we're not getting in Sinai, but God sends manna, bread that drops out of the sky when the people are hungry. And there's a bowl of manna in the ark. These are kind of three signs of God's deliverance of God's people, and that's all housed in a tent called the tabernacle, and that's where God commands sacrifices to be made, animal sacrifices, to be made to Him, to God. And that's where the whole, what eventually becomes the temple, um, um, sacrificial process, where that develops. In these kind of disorganized times, the tabernacle and the ark within it just kind of traveled around from place to place. At one point, when several of the tribes were being harassed by outsiders, they said, the one thing that all those people around us have in common is that they're all ruled by kings, and we don't have anybody like that. And they said, here comes Michael. They said to the prophet Samuel, give us a king. And God told the prophet to tell the people that it was a bad idea, that they would regret putting themselves under a king, but they insisted. God had Saul anointed king. Not all of the tribes agreed that Saul should be recognized as king. So Saul spent a fair amount of his 20 years on the throne trying to coerce the other tribes to recognize him as king. At the same time, he was trying to lead the defense of against whoever was trying to invade. Long story short, Saul goes mad and is replaced by King David. King David succeeds in quelling all of the contenders around, both around himself. He gets all 12 of the tribes to pledge allegiance to him. He also battles against all of the people who are threatening Israel, and he defeats them all. And he is this wonderful warrior shepherd king. He first makes his appearance as a shepherd, and David, having subdued everybody, chooses Jerusalem as his capital, and he moves the ark to Jerusalem, and then there he builds a magnificent palace for himself. And Jerusalem becomes it's called the city of Zion. It's the the place where eventually the temple gets built. But David, wonderful stories of David's bravery and faithfulness, and also as we've seen with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, with all of the greats, um, he's got feet of clay, and um, he gets in trouble. He um, he event at one point his own son, his heir apparent, Absalom, tries to kill him to gain the throne. Um, so it's a I think it's 40-year reign, where it is both peaceful and very turbulent. Peaceful in terms of aren't no armies at war and stuff like that, but very turbulent in terms of inside treachery and also very significant sins on the part of David. Um, David is succeeded by his son Solomon, and um, Solomon succeeds by. I mean, it's kind of like how do you make $1 million? You get your father to give you $1 million. How did he get to be a great king? His father David gave him the kingdom, and so he's the heir. Um, Toward the end of David's reign, David wants to build a temple. He says, I've got this incredible palace here in Jerusalem, and God is still living in a tent. And I want to build a magnificent temple for you. And God says, no, you're not the guy to do it. You have too much blood on your hands, is the term that God uses. And so when David dies and Solomon becomes king, he says, I want to build this. And God says, yeah, you didn't have anything to do with all those nasty wars. You inherited a peaceful kingdom. Go ahead and build it. And then God stipulates or commands how it should be built, kind of beam by beam. And um, it is intended to be a a building that is um, incredible in its presentation, and yet rather simple in its structure. And and he does several chapters about the building of the temple, um, and then interestingly, or when God actually moves into the temple like a cloud and kind of takes possession of this new home for a God who is the creator of the heaven and the earth. And he's somehow more present here than anywhere else in creation. And that's a really fundamental understanding to the importance of that spot, that is God's throne. Solomon, for all his riches and wisdom and so on, turns out also to be kind of a fallible guy. And in the last years of his reign, he takes kind of as his foreign policy is just to marry the princess from any kingdom. You name the kingdom, he said, just send me a princess. She'll be one of my wives, and we'll be allies. And he put that together. I think I shared with you all the second time that I was in Israel. One of the stops on the tour that I was on, that Kathy and I were on, was one of Solomon's summer palace, and it had three sections. It had the kind of the stately living part for the king, and then on one wing it had the stables, on the other wing it had the harem, and the stables and the harem were pretty much similar, at least in their ruins, in terms of the space they took up in the household. Anyway, Solomon kind of frittered away this incredible advantage he had, that he had received as David's successor. When Solomon dies, he declares that his son will be the new king, and some of the actually 10 of the tribes that were part of the united Israel, 10 of the tribes say, no, we don't want him as king. We've got this guy, and we're going to rally around this guy. And so after just three kings over a united Israel, Israel divides into two different kingdoms. And after that, the 10 northern tribes are known as Israel. The two tribes in the south, and that's Judah and Benjamin, they keep the name Judah. So Israel to the north, Judah to the south. Jerusalem is in Judah. So the northern kingdom needs to establish a new capital, and they eventually settle on Samaria as their new capital. And then for the next several generations, there are two nations, two kingdoms that have Jewish identities. And they fight against each other once in a while, but most often each of them allies itself with one of the larger countries that's around them and relies on them for the defense, for their defense. What ensues is, over the course of, and we're talking about several hundred years, there is the rise and the fall of several successive empires in the Middle East. The first one, and it comes from Syria, where today Syria and Iraq are, is the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire comes from the east and threatens to take over what's Israel and Judah. They eventually succeed, and they conquer the northern kingdom, Israel, and Israel is never heard of again. That's the lost 12 tribes of Israel. They disappear from history. Not too long after that, the Babylonian Empire, that's coming from just a little bit farther east, conquers the Assyrian Empire. They then come and threaten Judah, and in fact conquer Judah in 587 BC. They take all of the leaders, the elite of the people of Judah, who are now called Jews. They take the elite into exile in Babylon. And in Babylon, and so the elite would be like the royal families, the priests, the scribes. They are exiled to Babylon, and for almost 70 years, the elite of the Jews, of the Judahites, are resident in Babylon. And actually, some of them become government officials in Babylon. They show themselves to be trustworthy, and they work themselves into the government positions in Babylon. Meanwhile, what used to be Judah is just desolate. The Babylonians have pretty much leveled Jerusalem, ransacked and leveled the temple and the palace and everything. Then the Persian Empire comes from what's today Iran. The Persian Empire conquers the Babylonian Empire, and the Persian Empire decides it's in their best interest to set up a puppet kingdom in Judah. And they allow the Jews to leave Babylon and to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple and the government and even the walls. They become kind of the patron of a new Judah. And that's where the Old Testament story leaves off. The history continues, but it's not recorded in the Bible. But what happens historically is that after the Persians have conquered the area, eventually Alexander the Great comes down from Greece, and he conquers Turkey and then this area. And there is there's a time of couple of 100 years when Greece controls the area. Greece is a very well-developed, highly developed culture at that point. And they do some wonderful things, like during this time, they get Jewish scholars to come together and agree on the text of the Hebrew scriptures. They get translators to translate those scriptures into Greek, which is the universal language. That's what we now call the Septuagint. It's the first Greek version of what we Christians call the Old Testament, or the Greek version of the Hebrew scriptures. Let me stop there a second, see if there are questions. So during this time, and it's not, go ahead, Terry.
So I'm just wondering, during this last several hundred years, I guess, when, the Hebrews were taken over. Is that what I want to say?
Conquered.
And yeah, they were conquered. Thank you. Yes. And then eventually Persia comes in. Is God, you haven't really mentioned anything about God, you know, directing certain people to do certain things. I'm getting the impression here that these are not things that were sanctioned by God at
Well,
this point.
that's a really great question. There's one point when Babylon is still in control, and God says to Cyrus, who's the king of Persia, God says to Cyrus, I am anointing you. You are the Messiah who is going to redeem my people Israel. And it's Cyrus who then conquers the Babylonians and frees the Israelites. God has used Cyrus, this foreign pagan king, to advance God's story. Yeah, go ahead, Iris.
Why would God allow all this to happen to his people? Why would he let them suffer like this?
Yeah, that's an age-old question, and one that we talked a lot about at Wired Word today, because we were talking about Rabbi Kushner's book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People.
I have that book. I have it.
And there isn't a humanly satisfactory answer, at least not satisfactory to this human answer to that question.
And it's not only from back then, but it is from now, and that's what you're saying. That to your point, that's
it's always been, it's always been the case that when disaster strikes and so on, we naturally say, wait, don't we believe in God who is master of the universe? Couldn't God have done something to prevent this? And what the problem with that question is that it demands that we understand God, and we don't.
No.
We don't understand God. We believe that God, who created the heavens and the earth, sent Jesus to redeem a broken creation, and that because of that, we have this this relationship with God that is based on promise. Just like Abraham and Sarah, their whole life was based on responding to God's promise. That's what we do as well.
And yet the thing that I'm thinking, while you were talking about all the people back in history who responded to God, and when he directed them to do certain things, whether it was Abraham and then Moses and then David and all these people, I'm thinking, if I am supposed to be one of those people today, I don't know if I would know it. I'd like to believe that. Well, I think I do believe that there are maybe people even today who are being given directives by God for something, you know, but I don't know who they are, and I
Who are,
don't know.
who are the legitimate spokespersons for God these days, right?
Yes,
right, exactly.
exactly right. And that's what I
And
keep thinking, you know?
I think uh, I I think we have to I think we have to keep on going back to Scripture and say, what does Scripture teach us? And then recognizing that what Scripture teaches us is complicated and sometimes seems to be contradictory. We have to study it to pull out of it what is really the wisdom that God imparts through these ancient documents. We do the same thing with the church and the church's tradition. We also apply critical thinking to to those documents or those traditions, and they speak differently to different times. Um, Paul's teaching in the first century about the place of women, both in the church and in the home, is just unacceptable. We say no, you're wrong about that, and we can do that because Paul wasn't writing what he heard from God. He was writing what he understood based on what he understood of the gospel. But he had his shortcomings. Martin Luther had his shortcomings. We've talked before about Luther's diatribes against the Jews, and it's just embarrassing now for us to think that the guy that we memorialize in the name of our religion was such a jerk. Uh,
Not totally, okay?
not totally, and that's really the point. King David had absolutely everything he needed, and he looked over the balcony and saw Bathsheba and said, I don't have her. Even King David, you know the Moses sinned. That part of this tradition, part of this storyline, is that God uses very fallible human beings to carry out God's work.
Because humans make mistakes.
We do.
Yeah,
We're
and we
good at
do the
that.
best we can.
We're good at that. Yeah. We've majored in that.
Yeah, right, exactly. Okay.
So just in closing, just to tie up a loose end.
Okay.
In the Jewish tradition, there are stories about the time that is between the end of the Old Testament and what we call the New Testament.
Okay.
Or the birth of Jesus, and that includes the story of Hanukkah and
Sorry, what? Say again.
Hanukkah.
Okay, Hanukkah.
And it's set during the time of the Greek Empire in control of Jerusalem, of Judah, and the story is told in the Hebrew tradition. It's not in what we call the Old Testament or the New Testament. Also, not in the Old Testament or the New Testament is that that Alexander the Great's empire disintegrates. He divides it into 4 sub kingdoms, and they just start going to war against each other, and the empire falls apart, so that it's easy prey for the emerging Roman Empire. And the Romans conquer the Greeks around 60 BC. So about 60 years before the birth of Jesus, the Romans have become the occupying force. And that's where we are when we start the story of Jesus. And so we've gotten through, in 3 sessions, we've gotten through the Old Testament. We're going to have one session next week to get through the New Testament. And it's essential when we're talking about the story, the storyline. The story is, in the first case, the story of Jesus and his ministry, and then in the second case, the story of the church and its early ministry. Any closing questions?
What about for the 31st?
We are not going to be meeting on the 31st.
Oh, okay.
So we have one more meeting, right?
One more meeting, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to be on vacation on the 31st.
How many vacations do you take, mister?
As many as I can get away with.
Okay.
Yeah.
Have a good night, everybody.
Sorry I was late.
Good night.
Good night.
All right.